What I'd like to do is not talk about living in the community in the United States. What I'd like to outline for you is a development that's happening internationally through the convention that Diane mentioned, the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities, and then to compare the situation a bit in Israel and the United States. I'm just about completing, with sadness, my 2 years here in Israel, and I've been really looking a lot at how you've developed your laws and policies and practices regarding supporting people to live and make decisions about what they want. And I'd like to share with you some of my thoughts before I leave at the end of July, but I'll be back. The title of my talk is There's No Place Like Home, the right to live in the community for all. I'll talk a bit about the convention briefly because Diane already discussed it. I want to talk a bit about disability as a human rights issue, the particular article in the convention that establishes the right to live in the community, and then a brief comparison of U.S. and Israeli law. The United Nations Convention, as you know, was passed in 2006. It was the result of enormous self-advocacy. People with disabilities from all over the world came to the UN 3 weeks out of each year, twice a year, for 5 years. I had the honor and pleasure of participating in many of those meetings. As of today, 149 countries have signed the convention. That means they indicate their support. But until a country ratifies the convention, it doesn't really mean anything in terms of legal value for the people in those countries. Today, 101 countries have ratified it, but not yet Israel or the United States. However, I think Israel is well on its way, and hopefully very soon we will hear an announcement that Israel has ratified the convention. It's important. Why is it important? Because it establishes for the first time under international law, what does that mean? It's binding. When a country ratifies a convention, it becomes, in essence, part of the country's laws. It gives people's rights. It's used as awareness raising. And most importantly, in my mind, it's used as an organizing tool for people with disabilities to have a chance to demand what they want and how they want to be able to live within society. The purpose of the convention is to, quote, to promote, protect, and ensure the full and equal enjoyment of all human rights and fundamental freedoms by all persons with disabilities, and to promote respect for their inherent dignity. It sounds beautiful. Let's see what it really means in action. And as Diane said, the motto of this movement is nothing about us without us. And I'll share with you at the convention proceedings, in fact, it was people with disabilities themselves who identified not only the ideas for the convention, but literally the language that was used as well. Interestingly, the convention includes no definition of disability, and I want to mention that today because it is an inclusive document. It recognizes that disability is, quote, an evolving concept. What does that mean? That means how societies view disabilities may change over times. And most importantly, by not having a definition, it's not limiting the group, which may expand or contract. And certainly, as we use the example, I mean, I'm wearing glasses here. I don't consider myself a person with a vision impairment. But in some countries where one doesn't have access to glasses and one loses their eyesight, and they're weaving perhaps a rug in Guatemala, and their only way to earn income is by using their eyes to perform that task, that person would be considered a disability in that country. But most importantly, the convention puts forward what we call a social model of disability. It's not about the diagnosis, the impairment, the label. It's about how one's impairment interacts with society, and it's about society that has to change, not necessarily people. It includes both civil and political rights as well as economic, social, and cultural rights. Why is that important? It's important because it's the first UN convention ever to actually include all of the rights. In the past, the international law system, and I won't bore you as I do my law students, but there's a separate system for conventions that cover civil, political rights and economic, social, cultural rights. This convention brings it all together. Why? The idea is that it's great to say that an individual has the right to be free from employment discrimination, but if there's no work, how do you realize that right? So the convention is trying to move forward with practical steps as well as the social, as well as the civil and political rights. One of the most important aspects, I think, under civil and political rights is what I'm going to talk about for the next few minutes, and that's the right to live independently in the community. The right to live independently in the community is just part of the human rights perspective of this convention. The convention basically recognizes the equality of all people, regardless of their differences. And that's in the general principles. It says that there must be a respect for the inherent dignity, individual autonomy, including the freedom to make one's own choices and the independence of persons. And I think what's been very hard for many people in the field of disability is that when you also give people the freedom to make choices, they may also make mistakes. In terms of community living for all, Article 19, which, and I have to say I applaud Israel because it was really members of the Nitzivut, the Commission, Dina Feldman, Tirsa Leibowitz, and others who were really the active players in getting this article written the way it is. Article 19 sets out that the right of all people to be able to live in the community, quote, with choices equal to others. And that's important, that they can be able to choose where and how they want to live. It makes clear that the practice of isolating or segregating people with disabilities on the basis of disability in residential institutions is a violation of human rights. Article 19, I just want to select for you some key phrases. What it says, that the states to the convention recognize the equal right of all persons to live in the community, their full inclusion, participation. And let's look at Section A for a minute. It says, persons with disabilities have the opportunity to choose their place of residence, where and with whom they live, and on an equal basis with others, and are not obliged, will not be required to live in particular living arrangements. It's not particularly radical, right? For people without disabilities, we're allowed to choose wherever we live, whenever we want to live, provided we can afford the neighborhood, perhaps. But for people with disabilities, this right has not been realized, and now it is, at least under international law. What I want to share with you is some of the reactions to people I've spoken with over the past 2 years. People will say to me, oh, but people can be very, very lonely in the community. Or people are not ready to live in the community. They're not independent enough. Well, my response is, that's right, that could be. But it's the responsibility of governments, I believe, to establish programs to allow people to learn how to live as independently as they can, but to get as much support as they want. And those are really the goals of what we call supportive housing programs, which are now being developed in the United States and in Israel. In fact, I helped organize a study tour recently of people from your ministries to see some of our better supportive housing programs in the United States. But you don't have to look there, okay? For people in Israel, you have models and examples right here. What does supportive housing mean? Quickly, number one, we don't talk about continuum of services anymore. That's dead in the field. It's been replaced with the view that where a person lives does not dictate the support and assistance the person receives. Where you live is where you live, and what you need is what you need. It's based on the principle that people like to live in their own apartments or their homes with people they choose to live with. And people with disabilities have the right to receive the services where they live, just as other people, and that no one should be forced to move into particular housing situations. It's related directly to the notions of self-directed support. What does that mean? People should be able to choose the kind of services they receive, when, how much, how little, and from whom. And many people have responded to me when I've discussed this, oh well, but some people can't make decisions for themselves. Maybe they don't know where they want to live. Well, I've had experience with many people who can't speak, but can communicate in other ways, who may have difficulty thinking, but clearly can express preferences about who they like to live with. They smile when there's someone with them whom they trust, and they won't relate to someone whom they don't trust. So even people with severe disabilities who cannot speak or write, for example, can still indicate preferences regarding what they like to do, who they want to be with, and even what they like to do, what they like to see, and with whom they like to live. So even if a person is unable to communicate preferences, there's a possibility that others whom that person may trust can help them make that decision. And Yotam Taleb is going to talk at the end of this panel about supported decision making, how to help people who have difficulty making decisions on their own or who can't, really make some decisions that allow them to have some more control over their lives. The role of service providers, that's a different talk. I think it's very important for all of us in whatever profession we are working to think about what our role is and that it may be changing. Instead of providing direct services, maybe our goal will be to effectuate the person's preferences and to coordinate services. The ultimate goal here is to give people all types of disabilities the opportunity to, number one, live as independently as possible. And I wrote, independently but not lonely. No, we need to develop programs to support people who are living in the community so they learn to interact with neighbors, to make many choices about their lives, and to have as much control. That's what anti-discrimination means. That's what equality means. In the United States, as you may know, in 1990, we passed the Americans with Disabilities Act. It doesn't prohibit institutions, and it doesn't require everyone with a disability to be able to live in their own homes. But Title II of the Act, which covers public services and programs, does require that all programs and services be provided in the most integrated setting possible. Okay? The most integrated setting possible. What does that mean? In 1999, the U.S. Supreme Court decided a case, and it had to decide what does it mean on behalf of two women who had been living in institutions who wanted to leave. And the state, in fact, said, yes, we'd love them to leave. They're ready to leave. They'll need support, but they're ready to leave. But we don't quite have the services available to them. And the Supreme Court, in a decision written by Justice Ginsburg, who I know has traveled to this country in the past, stated that these two women have the right to receive care and services in the most integrated setting appropriate, and that their unnecessary institutionalization was discrimination under the ADA, under the most integrated setting mandate of the ADA. Even better, in 2010, just last year, a court in New Jersey, it's a lower court decision, but it had to decide what it meant by living in the community. And I think this is very important. The court here said that the test about living in the community is not whether a state calls a building a home in the community. In Israel, for example, you have hostels in the community. And the court said that we don't look at what you call it. We look to see whether a particular setting enables individuals with disabilities to interact, for example, with non-disabled people to the fullest extent possible. Are they able to participate in the life of the community? And the failure to provide placements in a setting that enables people with disabilities to interact violates the law. In 1998, you here in Israel enacted the Equal Rights for People with Disabilities law. And I had a role in that a long time ago, 1993. And amazing things are happening under the law, as you'll hear from Achia Kamar and his talks about what the Commission has done in terms of accessibility and employment. But there's one issue that still needs work, and that's the right to live in the community here under law for people in Israel. A couple of years ago, the Supreme Court here decided a case that was similar to the Olmsted case in the United States. The case was brought on behalf of 5 people with severe disabilities who were living at home. It was time, they were growing up, the parents and the families saying they should be living in the community like other people their age. In this case, the court, it has mixed results because on one hand, the government changed its policy as a result of this case. On its own, it decided that its policy of requiring people to be sufficiently independent to live in the community would change, so that now they actually will require an examination of every person and their ability, not creating categorization of people who can't be moved into the community. That's good. But in the decision, the court failed to really listen to what I thought was the evidence presented by the plaintiffs about what living in the community means for them. The court refused to look behind the words of the statute, of the government, and to decide what is the quality of life and how can the court protect it. So ultimately, the court upheld the ministry's decision to place these 5 people in large hostels that are called community programs, but in fact function much like institutions. Since the case was decided, it's not over yet. The 5 people are still living at home, and there's negotiations about where they will be living with some of the not-for-profits, NGOs here in Israel. And at first, the government proposed that they live in a large hostel in Beit Safafa, which is an Arab village in Jerusalem. And at first you may say integration is important. Certainly in America we would want different communities to live together. But it posed a problem here for Jewish youth who don't know Arabic to be living in an Arab village. And clearly that was not the appropriate placement in this case, and the government has backed down, as I understand. There may be representatives here, and are now working with Bizchut and the plaintiffs to find alternate arrangements. More recently, just last week, there was a case brought to the Israeli Supreme Court involving Ilanit, an institution you may know. And the Supreme Court has refused to intervene in that case, although Bizchut will now be allowed to investigate the conditions there, which by some accounts certainly amount to human rights violations of people lying naked on the ground, being tied to chairs, with bruising and evidence of beating. These are investigations that rise to the level of human rights violations, and in other countries have been found to be a violation of human rights law. Okay, so where are we? The right of people with disabilities to live in the community has now become a binding international legal imperative. It's law. But changes will not occur overnight, nor should we expect them to. The CRPD itself recognizes the principle of progressive realization, so it will take time for the United States, for Israel, for all countries to conform to the convention. Ultimately, change for people with disabilities in Israel and the U.S. depends on the implementation and activism about our own laws. Why is it important? It's important because, as we know, people with disabilities have the right not just to be integrated into the community, not even just to be accepted, but really to belong. And who benefits? People with and without disabilities. Thank you very much.